So welcome everyone to this webinar on the GDPR, on consent and on anonymization. Those of you who joined in the data management workshop for Grow GCRF projects, which is now 3 weeks ago, will know that this is one of the additional training sessions that people were interested in receiving. So there's one today and then another one on Friday for 1 hour, just sharing some information on this particular topic. So my name is Veerle. I'm the research data manager for the drugs and disorder projects, which is a GCRF project based at SOAS with partners in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Colombia. And besides that, I've worked for 13 years. I've now left, but I worked for 13 years with the UK Data Archive or the UK Data Service, where, of course, we were providing a lot of guidance and training to researchers on good data management practices and how to open up their data, what to do during research so data could be reused in future, etc. So a lot of what I'm going to tell you here is based on that guidance that we developed at the UK Data Archive. But what's also been interesting is then, of course, being part now of the project at SOAS for the last 1.5 years and needing to implement all that good practice guidance into a practical but complex research setting. So apart from the guidance, I'll then also say how we approached all these topics within the Drugs and Disorder Project, what we've done to implement it. That doesn't mean that that's the only way. Other projects have done it in other ways, and it's interesting to learn from each other's experiences. And we've already seen that in the discussions that we had 2 weeks ago during the workshop, that different projects implement different things, and that's all valid and good practices that are being implemented. I'm gonna switch off my video whilst I talk because it makes me feel a bit more comfortable, but I'm happy to switch it back on when we go into discussion at the end. So at any one time, if you've got questions, pop them in the chat if you want to. I'll try not to speak too long so that we've got plenty of time for discussions at the end. So I'll try to cover the presentation in 20-25 minutes, and then we have at least half an hour to discuss.
You're muted, Veerle.
I've done the wrong one. Sorry, I did the wrong one. I muted myself instead of switching off my video. Okay, so I think the commonality that we have across a lot of the GCRF projects is that it's complex research projects with people in low and middle income countries, complex situation, complex topics. There might be qualitative data being collected, it might deal with vulnerable people, it might deal with conflict situations, etc. There's the aspect of ethical obligations that researchers have that are very different across different countries and cultures. The data protection or data privacy legislation will also be different across a lot of different legislations. In the UK, we're bound by the Data Protection Act 2018, which comes out of the GDPR legislation. Other countries will have their own data privacy legislation, or might not. There's the funder expectation. In our case, that's ESRC, the expectation to share the research data as evidence and for future reuse as much as possible. So we have the question, how can we protect anonymity of research participants? Is it ethical to share data, etc. So I'm going to first whiz through the obligations in terms of ethical and legal obligations, and then see what advice we used to give at UKDA, or they still do at UKDA, on how you handle those aspects. Sorry. So ethical obligations are, of course, key in research with people as participants. So typically it goes through ethical review, key aspect I think always to keep in mind is that the ethical obligation is to avoid social and personal harm to research participants. But there's also the aspect of upholding scientific standards, and often for research ethics committees, the complying with relevant laws becomes an important aspect. So for institutions, that's an important component of the ethical obligations. It's important to also keep in mind where you're looking at that expectation of funders to make data available for future reuse, that also data repositories that handle social science data, in particular qualitative data, they know how to handle these things. So they also have their ethical and legal procedures in place so that they can make these data available within the framework of the ethical and legal obligations that researchers have towards their participants. And so data sharing is not a violation of data privacy or of research ethics. It's about having good measures in place to facilitate that. And it's interesting, I think, to look at the ESRC framework for research ethics, because it tries to combine these different components of the obligation researchers have towards their participants, but also the obligations they have, in a way, the ethical obligations towards society. And it sits framed within what I highlighted here in green: maximize the benefit of research for individuals and society whilst minimizing the risk and harm, and also the focus on research integrity, research transparency, which brings out that ethical aspect of making your data transparent, making your evidence transparent, etc. So these are interesting things to look at within that ethical framework. Apart from the research ethics, there's also, from a legal point of view, there's in the UK, there is a duty of confidentiality that applies to research. So people have a duty of confidentiality. It's expressed in common law. It might apply to research that if information is given within a context of confidence, and then you shouldn't disclose it without the consent of the provider. And that's already where informed consent becomes an important aspect to deal with this duty of confidentiality. Yeah? So the individual to whom the information relates can consent to having that information shared. So then you can open up that information, and you gain then consent for that. Data sharing becomes an important aspect. Then we obviously have the General Data Protection Regulation, and I'm going to whiz through some of the responsibilities there. I think a key note to make before starting on that is that and it gets emphasized time and again when I talk to other people that manage research projects or that deal with researchers handling research data. If you have good data practices in place, then GDPR is easy to abide by, easy to achieve. So it's not something that stands in the way of research. It's something that gives a framework and a context for good data practices. So the GDPR applies to personal data that are related to living individuals. It is information that allows you to identify directly or indirectly a living person. Anonymized data is not personal data, so then the GDPR does not apply, but we'll look at that in a few minutes' time. It can be very difficult to fully anonymize data in a lot of research setups. The GDPR applies to any European researcher who collects personal data about a citizen of any country anywhere in the world. But it also applies to, it always talks about data controllers, but a researcher would be a data controller or a data processor if you're collecting personal data. It also applies to a researcher then based outside the EU collecting personal data on EU citizens. So it works two ways here. So any UK-based researchers doing research anywhere in the world, the GDPR applies to those people. There is then 6 principles for the processing of those personal data. Yeah, and transparency and informing participants about what you do and why you do it is a very important component within that, because you need to process personal data lawfully, fairly, transparently. So tell people what you're doing, why you're doing it, why you're collecting personal information. You need to keep to your purpose. There's an exception there for research for that. Minimization is an important aspect. So don't collect personal data if you don't need them. Don't keep them for longer than is necessary. Uphold the accuracy. So keep them accurate and up to date. Remove them if you don't use them. And ensure integrity and confidentiality of data. So make sure they can't be tampered with, can't be changed, it can't be lost accidentally, etc. So those are the principles. Those principles were also in place in the previous data protection legislation that we had in the UK. For archiving and research, there is an exemption that further processing of personal data can be allowed, and personal data can also be stored for longer periods. But you need to then again have technical and organizational measures in place for data minimization. So it can be that you pseudonymize them is one aspect, for example. Another technical aspect can be secure storage of that information, etc. Data subjects, so the people whose personal information you're collecting, they have important rights. So they have the right to be informed, they have the right to access the information, the personal information you keep on them, the right for that to be corrected if that is not correct, the way you keep it, the right to be forgotten, the right for personal information to be removed, the right to restrict processing, the right to portability, the right to object. Now, not all these rights necessarily apply to research. A lot of the data protection legislation, of course, comes also in to deal with how personal data are handled by companies in commercial transactions, by banks, etc. It's important to keep that in mind. If you are then processing personal data, so if in research you are collecting personal data about research participants, then you need to have a legal reason to do so, and you need to define that reason in advance. And there can be 6 legal reasons for processing personal data, and I've circled the ones that are typically applicable to research. So it can either be you have the consent of the person to process their personal data. It can be in the public interest, assuming that research is in the public interest or research is carried out by a public entity such as a university, or it can be legitimate interests. Yeah? There's also reasons for example, contract, legal obligation, protecting vital interests. And I've added a table, and this is based on work we did at the UK Data Service to try and illustrate that with some examples to make that a bit more easy to understand of where might be the research setup to use consent, to use public interest, to use legitimate interest, etc. Now in the UK, a lot of the funders and a lot of the organizations and universities will encourage researchers to use public interest or public task as the legal ground for processing personal data, if personal data are being collected. But it could be, for example, that consent is better to use, and an example might be you're asking in a public opinion poll for an email address because you want to invite people later on to join in a focus group discussion or something like that. So then you may need to ask that through a consent procedure. Or it's qualitative data on particularly sensitive topics. It might be difficult to anonymize the data fully, so it might be that the data, the interviews you collect are being considered as also personal information, could reveal the identity of the people. It might be difficult to indicate to the interviewees there that you are collecting that information on the basis of public interest or public task. So then it might be preferential to use consent. Oral history projects typically collect people's real names and have permission, then ask them permission to publish that data, those life histories with people's names in it. That's another example where you might get the consent of the person to do so. Yeah. And the other examples you can look at, the examples given here. I'm not going to talk through each of those individually. I'll be sharing the presentation afterwards as well, so you can check for yourself. So if you then look at to which degree GDPR would be different from the data protection legislation that was there before, then there's not a lot of difference, but everything has become a lot more explicit. There's a very strong emphasis on transparency in everything, to have clear information, clear documentation of why you're processing data, personal data, how you're processing that, informing participants about that, documenting that consent procedures, etc. Yeah. And the whole idea there is that people whose information you collect have got more control over their personal data. Yeah. Another big difference is that it's easier enforced now through national bodies, which wasn't the case before. Yeah. So if a breach of data protection legislation is notified to the national body, in the case of the UK, that's the ICO, then they have to investigate and take action. Whereas previously you had to take issues to court yourself. Now it's up to the national body to deal with that. When we then at the UK Data Service looked at how you now, within that framework of your ethical obligations, the duty of confidentiality, the data protection legislation, how can you then manage research data that have been collected from people during your research, but also importantly, how can you do that in the long term? How can you make those data available for reuse in future? Then important aspects to keep in mind there is, and you have to consider those jointly. Informed consent is very important, both for ethical reasons. It could be for data protection reasons, but mainly also for ethical reasons. And consider data sharing and data archiving as part of that informed consent as well. That's the way you deal with that in a very transparent way, how you address duty of confidentiality, making sure you have permissions in place, etc. Now, informed consent for data sharing is typically applied a lot in the context of qualitative data, interviews, etc. Less so in survey settings, in the setup where data are very easily anonymized, then it's less applicable. But definitely in qualitative research, it's a good recommendation. Identities of people need to be protected. That can either be done by not collecting personal data, is an important strategy, that minimization, and then also can be done through anonymization, pseudonymization. Access control to data can also be important. Yeah, you can restrict or open up data, and it needs to be considered jointly, because possibly in your informed consent procedure, you need to be able to indicate how you will protect identities, whether or not you will be anonymizing data, whether or not you can implement access controls or access restrictions, etc. Yeah? And when it comes to personal data and confidential data, that needs to be securely stored, of course. So consent across the data lifecycle is then important. So it's about people engaging in the research process, what you will do as a researcher with that information as part of the research project, but also what you might do with the data in future if there is an expectation of your funder to keep that, to archive that data, make it available for reuse, but also if you as an organization want to hold on to that, it is important to tell people that that is your intention, that that becomes a source of evidence, a source of future use of those data. Yeah. Consent then addresses those ethical responsibilities you have as a researcher. It addresses the aspect of confidentiality, the duty of confidentiality, and it may also be addressing the processing of personal data under the GDPR. In the case of the GDPR, if consent is the legal basis for collecting and processing personal data, then it's important that you keep it separate from other consent requirements. So in the information you provide, or in the information sheet, or in the consent form, make it explicit that you might have certain parts of consent for your ethical responsibilities, and other parts of consent for specifically collecting, processing, handling personal data. So keep it separate. Consent then needs to be freely given, informed, unambiguous, very specific or granular, and clearly affirmative. So people not responding can't be taken as consent. It can't be inferred from silence, from pre-tick boxes, etc. And participants can withdraw consent to process their personal data. Again, that is different from withdrawing from research. So people have the right to withdraw from research. That is one thing. That's an ethical aspect of in the research process, in the consent procedures. People can withdraw consent to process specifically their personal data if they have been collected through the consent procedure. So it's again important to try and keep that very separate. Consent must be documented. That doesn't mean it needs to be in a written consent form, and that's often a misunderstanding amongst researchers, something that ethical committees will very strongly push, but it's again something that often, in particular in the context of these GCRF projects, might be very difficult to achieve, is to use written consent forms in a meaningful way that mean that informed consent is actually indeed informed. So you can have verbal consent agreements, you can also document that, you can record it, you can write down what the procedure is. That's a way of documentation as well. And if you're processing special categories of personal data, race, ethnic origin, etc., they're listed there, then you need what is called explicit consent. If you're collecting them on the basis of consent, you need explicit consent. So it's more explicit than just verbal consent, for example. So maybe a handwritten sentence stating that you give your explicit consent, or a two-stage process of consent. If informed consent is not possible, then you probably need to look at another legal basis for processing personal data. If informed consent, and again, the GDPR gives really interesting guidance on that, where, for example, in certain setups, informed consent might be meaningful. For example, if it is between an employer and an employee in a research process, or if it is researchers and maybe vulnerable people in certain situations that might feel pressured to say yes to a question about consent, etc. So if informed consent is not meaningful in the context of the research, then another legal basis needs to be looked at if personal data need to be processed. And then also, if personal data are processed through or collected through consent for the GDPR, there's very specific requirements of what a consent form and information sheet needs to provide in terms of details of the data controller, the researcher, contact details, specific statements of their rights, the reminder that they can withdraw their personal data, etc. Lots of transparency there, so that information is important. When data are anonymized, they no longer apply, GDPR no longer applies, or data protection legislation no longer applies, but it can be very difficult to fully anonymize data, yeah? Especially if you're looking at qualitative data. So it's better to be careful with promises of full anonymity to research participants. Yeah? Can be very, very difficult to achieve that. In practice for consent procedures, then, be clear, be transparent about information, indicate steps you take to safeguard anonymity or confidentiality of information, make it clear that people have the right to withdraw, and keep the language easy. It's very important, and try to address all these aspects of current uses, future uses, etc. Yeah. Quickly, again, coming back to that written or verbal, so there's no legal requirement for consent to be written. There is advantages to it. From a legal point of view, it's more solid. might be required by an ethics committee. It offers more protection, but it can also have disadvantages. And it's something we've experienced in our GCRF project is a lot of people are really not willing to sign a form to put their name down on a particular form as indicating that they have provided information to a particular research project. So verbal consent is absolutely fine. It can also be recorded. It can also be documented. GDPR again distinguishes between anonymizing and pseudonymizing, which is an interesting concept. So if data are fully anonymized or anonymous, they're not related to an individual, GDPR doesn't apply. But if they're pseudonymized, then GDPR still applies. So they're still then considered to be personal data. Yeah. In pseudonymized data, typically what you do is you code and you apply certain anonymization techniques. You can no longer attribute the personal data to a specific person without the use of additional information. For example, the code that you've applied that might be matched with the name of the individuals. And you keep that very separately. But even if you have that separately, it's still considered to be personal data. So personal data that have undergone pseudonymization must still be considered as information about an identifiable natural person. And what GDPR indicates is that you need to be taken into account all the means that are reasonably likely to be used by the controller or by another person to identify the natural person directly or indirectly. The way we used to explain this that UKDA is that if you as a researcher have collected information, you have somewhere a key that indicates which code of a particular data record matches which individual. To you, that is personal information that you're handling. If you're passing that information on to another organization, another institution who doesn't have access to the codes, and the code is securely stored away and cannot be accessed, then that could be considered as anonymized data, because you can assume that it's you have the means reasonably likely to be used to access the codes would mean that they have to hack into your system. But again, it's within the legal context, it's sort of a possibly still a gray area that needs to be that will be looked at in more detail, no doubt, as years pass with GDPR legislation. Anonymization techniques that are then typically applied to pseudonymized data, if you collect it from people, is to use pseudonyms. For example, in interviews, in textual interviews, you can use pseudonyms or codes. And then you have the techniques such as reducing the detail, basically, of what you have in the data, reducing the precision. So you aggregate information to become more general. You remove location names and you have bigger areas that you refer to in your data. You restrict certain upper or lower ranges or outliers in your information. You use specific standard coding frames. You generalize the meaning of particular textual information, etc. If anonymization is not possible, then you need to look at the other two aspects. You need to look at consent for sharing possibly non-anonymized data, or you need to look at regulating or restricting access to the data. So that's important to keep in mind. So if you have data that cannot be fully anonymized and you want to be able to make them available, then you need to consider whether you can gain consent to do it, to have to minimize the risk as much as possible by applying certain anonymization techniques, but indicating that maybe you can't reduce the risk to zero. Data archives also can control access and will apply that when they make data available within a legal framework for reuse purposes. So this was the framework that the UK Data Archive applies, which is very similar to what social science data archives across the world will be applying, that you have tiers of access, open, control, safeguarded, or restricted, and then controlled, whereby in the category of the safeguarded data, you consider that there might be a minimal risk for individuals to be identified, and therefore you have user agreements in place, legal agreements in place that will facilitate providing access for research purposes, for example, or for other purposes. What did we then do for the drugs and disorder project in particular? So field research was carried out in Afghanistan, Myanmar, Colombia, mainly by the local partners. So in each of those countries, we have 2 local research organizations. They carry out the field work. The data that are collected come from interviews, life histories, focus group discussions, observations, photographs, surveys, third-party data, press information, etc. Also satellite images. And the information is collected from drug users, drug producers, drug traders, etc. So a lot of complexity, a lot of sensitivity in that information. So from an ethical point of view, we have an ethics and security panel in place on which we have representations from across all these partners in the different countries. And from early on in the project, and that continues now, we discuss and address issues on an ongoing basis. Yeah? Doing no harm to participants and to researchers as well is crucial within that. And so we try to come up with solutions to address those differences, the nuances in ethics that exist between the UK and other countries. We've also asked all of the partners to provide information on ethics and security that is applicable within their organization or within their country. So what is the ethical and security setup? What are the needs that they have? What needs addressing? Where do they need capacity building, etc.? Or what are the expectations of local governments, etc.? Yeah. So what are ethical procedures that are typically applied in your research? What kind of consents, statements will you be using? If it's not consent forms, then if it's verbal, then what is the consent statements that you will typically use with interviewees? Which security measures are there in place? What are the risks that come with the field research, etc.? In some of the research gathering activities, written consent forms are used, but it's mostly verbal consent forms because participants do not really want to sign a particular form. But the wording is always written out in advance, and that is what is being used in the research setup. So we have documentation of this is the sort of the information we read out before an interview starts, for example. Similarly, in that consent wording, there is information that data will be kept for future users. The strong advice we give as a project to the field research is to not collect people's names during interviews. Not always easy, because there's been discussions with field researchers who used to keeping people's names because that's the easiest way to refer to a particular interview or a particular data collection event. So it's easy to have the person's name in the interview or in the file or in the data sheet records to recall later on who they've spoken to, etc. Local data privacy legislation might not require them to not do this, but so as a GCRF project, we try to embed these practices that would be expected from UK-based researchers. So we try to advise that if collecting people's names can be avoided, it should be done. So the data protection measures then is using codes for interviewers and also for interviewees, and those codes are used throughout the different systems, the data sheets, the transcripts, the translations, etc. To not use people's names in file names, but use those codes instead. There's security procedures in place when interviews are being recorded, whether they use a recording device or whether they take note, for how that is transported back to their the local offices, etc. Those were security procedures that were already in place within the organization. So we didn't really have to change anything there. So they're aware of the security issues enough for their own local staff, etc. There's non-disclosure agreements when data need to be sent, for example, to external transcribers or translators. Something I worked on strongly when I first joined was on the practical aspects of data security. So making sure that all the laptops and the hard drives are being used are encrypted, that there's encryption procedures if files need to be transferred, for example, to transcribers or to translators. And for UK-based researchers, the understanding is within the project that they don't have access to personal data on the interviewees. If they would have access, then they need to comply with GDPR. So we try to minimize the need for having access to personal data. That's been our approach in the project. For storage and exchange of data, we use glass cubes as a system that was already in place by the project manager to share information across the project, reports and other items. It is a secure and a GDPR compliant system. So we have okayed it to be used as a collaborative workspace for sharing data on the project. But there's also, again, certain measures in place. So it is ISO 27001 compliant. It's also Cyber Essentials certified. The requirement is still that the data are first pseudonymized by the partner organization that has collected them before they're placed on glass cubes. Once they're on glass cubes automatically encrypts it and ensures backups. And we set up data workspaces per country or per partner according to the needs. Whomever needs to have access gets given access, but if there doesn't need to be access across more partners, then we limit the access. So only people that need access to certain data will have access to the data. So it's on a needs basis, and the access is managed then by the project manager and myself as research data manager. So part of the learning process has been to encourage field researchers to help the anonymity of participants by using codes as much as possible, by not collecting personal information where it's not needed as a good practice. We're also discussing data archiving and future reuses of data. The partners themselves are interested in keeping data for the long term for their own purposes and in developing a certain data repository capacity. So that's discussions that we're starting at the moment, actually, to see what we can do across the project and with the local partners in terms of how data can be kept beyond the life of the project. And whilst anonymity can be ensured to a certain degree, the researchers also need to keep in mind that offering full anonymity to participants might be impossible in this type of research, and so need to be openly discussing those aspects with participants. I see that lots of things have come into the chat box already, so let's open this up for questions. I'm going to start my video again, and then I think you can also all unmute yourself and ask questions directly, or I'll also look through the chat to see what things have been put in there already. But you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask.
Herr Veerle, are you okay for me to start?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
yeah, and I'm looking at your question, I think already.
Okay, thanks.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I'm Barbara Adolf. I'm the project leader of the Sentinel project under the GROW cohort of GCRF. And we had sort of issues that are a bit sort of less technical issues, but more sort of social issues, if you want, or institutional issues. And basically, there's been a bit of pushback from some of our partners on sort of what they see as imposing UK or European rules on the way they manage data. Now, you know, we have three different options in a way, or three different experiences. One is that partners don't have data protection and ethical guidance and are quite happy to adopt ours, and that can work. The second is that they have their own and that they are maybe, let's say, good enough also for the purpose, and then we can use theirs. But we've had some cases where partners basically don't see the need for that level of data protection because in their culture or society it's not a normal thing to do, and it puts us in a difficult situation because obviously we have to make sure that minimum standards are met, but on the other hand we are a bit reluctant to coerce people into following rules that they feel are being imposed on them unreasonably. So it would be useful to see what other projects experience has been with that situation, how people have dealt with it. I mean, obviously we've tried to explain why this is important, and the guidance that you presented earlier in the slide was like whenever a UK or EU researcher participates in the research, then we have to follow GDPR rules. Now, obviously, the participating is again a sort of slightly vague thing because the research could be led by a southern organization who then say, well, we are leading on it, so we should use our guidance. But a UK researcher might be using, for example, PhD or a postdoc, might be using that data or be involved in the research, even if they're not leading it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so if there's any,
and
any
have you
advice
then,
on that?
Have you then noticed that that it gives you problems with your institution in the UK, in that, for example, might the partners from abroad send data to you that contain names, and you sort of go, no, panic. We don't want
not so far, but that could well happen in the future, because I think the information we've collected so far wasn't personalized, but it might well happen in the future. So
I think it's for that same reason that we've decided to because it was interesting 2 weeks ago in the discussions that we had, then, that some projects have applied GDPR to across the entire partnership. It's not an approach we've taken, and I think it's for the same reasons, in that you need to be also show respect for the local research customs or research rules that apply locally, and it might be difficult to apply a full GDPR compliant system in a country where it's not meaningful. So our approach has sort of been, look, the guidance and advice that we give you is that you don't collect personal data, but of course we can't stop them from doing that, from writing down people's names in their notes, etc. But there's good reason to not do that, because it's better for your participants as well. They might, and there is a case that participants might run a risk at times, and the researchers are aware of that locally as well, that if data fall into the wrong hands with people's names in it, that's a problem as well. But we've sort of said, well, before you share that data with UK-based researchers, you really need to remove names. You need to have codes in there. So you need to do the editing, etc. And only then can it be shared with UK-based researchers. So far, I think that's worked. Of course, I can't go and check whether what is applied when the UK-based researchers go there and look at the data. But it's trying to come to those types of compromise, I think, isn't it? Yeah. I don't know what other projects have experienced in that respect, whether there's anyone else who wants to share experiences.
So my name's Richard. I'm the operations manager on the Grow Colombia project, working on biodiversity in Colombia. I don't have a huge amount to say, but in terms of sharing our experience, we have done some survey-based research on people both in the UK and in Colombia, all of which we have followed, tried our best to follow GDPR practices, and embedding that into consent forms, and running the proposed research through ethics committees, both in Colombia and in the UK before the work proceeds. So from that point of view, we've tried to be GDPR compliant throughout. I mean, there are other types of data, not personal data, that other things apply to. I guess one area where there was a little bit of uncertainty on my part was where a researcher was giving a workshop or a training in a rural area and took the opportunity to have conversations with people, and maybe has thought that might inform him and how he goes about in future work. But I don't think he recorded any of those conversations, and certainly didn't identify anyone from those conversations. So I'm assuming that we don't have to kind of justify that, or yeah, I mean, that was unplanned. This guy kind of did it without forward planning. I think he just decided it would be a good idea to talk to some people. So it was a bit of an informal process. So I feel a little uncomfortable about that, actually, because it would have been better to plan it and to have decided as a project whether that needs any explicit consent or whatever other basis we want to capture data on.
Oh my God, I do that all the time, talking to people informally. I didn't think that was critical. I mean, that's part of being, you know, like we don't get a chance to go to some of these places so often. So I talk to everyone I meet. I don't take notes and I don't put names down. I never even thought that it would be, not.
It would only be an issue if you're really capturing personal information there, isn't it? If you're writing down people names and
So probably I'm overreacting and being overcautious. That's actually very reassuring that I don't have to worry about this. I mean, I don't think I do, but yeah.
There's also, I mean, it's interesting to see also, because there's also something in GDPR about that GDPR very strongly applies to lists of personal data, to digital information, to structured information. So handwritten notes, I think if you look at GDPR, it doesn't apply there. But I think in the UK, my understanding is in the UK, the Data Protection Act 2018, it does apply there. So you sort of have this, I mean, there is all these gray nuances still within data protection legislation that will exist. And I think it's also valid to say it might not always be easy to enforce even researchers to adhere to it. You have to indicate to them what the rules and regulations are and what is expected of them. But ultimately, what they do in the field is you can't go and check and control that. But where I see my role as a data manager for the project is to make sure that when data come into the system we use for the project, that there's no personal information in there, that the names have been removed, etc., and to give that and to indicate to people why that is important, why there is that data protection legislation, therefore that should be avoided, and that is just good practice in general. And I think I'm lucky to be based at SOAS, because SOAS, in doing so much research in similar setups, the person responsible for data protection and compliance, etc., approved the procedures that we have in place, and is for example understanding of the fact that you can't use written consent forms and only verbal consent in certain contexts, etc. Whereas I've definitely already heard stories of other researchers at other organizations who might have more problems with that because the institution may be less familiar with that type of research, I guess.
Yes, I think that's the case at our organization, which has traditionally been a scientific research institute. So we have now a scientific project, but with a lot of social science involved. So it is a bit new for us. So I guess we are learning still.
Yeah. Barbara, I see another question that you put in the chat, which was about pseudonymization. How can you ensure that researchers are following the guidance, keeping codes and lists separately? Again, I mean, I don't think you can unless you go and audit them. Which again, I don't see as my role as a research data manager to absolutely enforce that or to go and check up on that. I see my role as giving them the advice and the guidance on how it should be done, and to discuss that with them and see whether they have problems with it or issues with it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I mean, is there a legal side to it? So as project leads, are we responsible for, I mean, if any data, personal data was leaked, and in the very worst scenario, I mean, it's unlikely to happen, but I mean, let's assume some personal data leaked and was going to the press or had any negative impact on individuals, and wouldn't we at least morally be responsible, because we are the people who are leading the project and should have, I mean, yeah, as you said, we try to take all precautions we can, but we are not actually able to enforce it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so I think in our case, the approach has been that sort of that regular discussions on these issues, why it is important, how it is different in different countries, and to look at the diversity of aspects. So UK might be concerned with GDPR, but then in other countries, for example, Myanmar and Afghanistan, there's also issues reasons why security is important, but for reasons that are different from our needs. So it's having those discussions on what are the needs and why it is important to be careful with data, and especially with people's names and identifying information, etc. Yeah. Don't know whether there's other questions. I'm looking at the chat.
Well, I put something there actually. I'm Alessia from CFAS project. We don't collect personal data as such as part of the project. My question though is, we're obviously moving a lot more on doing online training courses. So for training courses, you would collect personal data for people that attend, or there is also been a question about recording those lessons, those training courses, as use them as a future material for other courses. Would you need explicit consent from people when they attend that the recording is happening? And when they are attending an online training course and you put their name down in a register, for instance, and you record their names and email addresses or whatever it may be, again, do you need explicit consent if people are outside of the project and are taking part?
I guess in theory you probably in theory you probably need to ask their permission if you're going to be placing it online, or at least indicate to them when they register to attend that you have plans to place the recording online. But again, I mean, were you asked when you registered for this event whether it was okay for this session to be recorded? For this session to be recorded and to see whether I would put it on online afterwards. I guess we're probably not, I don't think we would place the discussion online. So if we place a recording online, it would just be me talking, I guess, and not necessarily the discussion afterwards. I might just write it out rather than
well, because this is what I was thinking. I was thinking I've never been asked if while I'm attending this Zoom meetings if I give consent. But of course, I suppose this is something that we will be doing together as a group, and perhaps is distributed only to the group. Whereas the point where the researchers are coming from is that if I'm doing it, I'd like to use it again outside of the project, perhaps, or with a wider audience. So that's why the question arose.
And I guess the standard procedure seems to be what's used in those setups seems to be that when you start the session, to ask people whether they're happy for the recording to be placed online. But I guess it's again that inferring a yes from people not speaking up, which is very contradictory to what that tells you. Yeah.
Well, also, I mean, if they say no, it basically means you can't participate in the session. You're not going to stop recording, but you're basically saying, sorry, you need to then leave the training or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's never happened to me, but I guess.
Yeah.
I suppose it's making them aware that that is happening, perhaps. It's the way you cover your back, as it were. And also, my comment on the chat, my question, you talked about encryption of laptops.
Yeah.
So everybody works with a laptop, and laptops are one of those items that people love to steal. So that has always been at the back of my mind. So although, again, data that we collect is not necessarily about subjects, because our project is to do with soil data and water data and things like that. But I am still a little bit skeptical about people taking their laptops everywhere and even having them at home, because somebody could break in and steal them. So I just wonder, did you, when you said about you took some time about encryption of laptops, did you enforce it?
No. We didn't enforce it. So what we did was so I discussed it also with the IT department at SOAS, what would be the best approach. So what we did is we did an audit first of all, who was using laptops across the project, and of course the majority of those are not purchased by the project. So it's the different organizations, and what their operating systems were they encrypted, yes or no, and then I drew up guidance. And we published it. It's in our data management guide that's on the project's website as well. So we specified how they could encrypt laptops, entire laptops or hard drives, or maybe a box on there, like a folder on their laptop to keep encrypted data in. And then I have visited each of the partners. I've done site visits, and then I would discuss that again with them and say, have you done the encryption? Yes, no. I didn't sort of ask them to show me again, because that seems imposing.
Yes.
You give the guidance, you say, look, I'm happy to help you. Shall we do it together? And so for some organizations, we did it together. And other organizations said, yeah, we've done it and it's fine.
It is a kind of,
it's
it feels
dialogue.
very, and it feels like you're walking on a very fine line, because you don't want to impose things to people, but at the same time the project seems to put, or the funder seems to put an awful lot of responsibility on the lead organization to kind of follow the directives, various things. So it becomes a little bit difficult sometimes to have the conversation without sounding like you want them to do something.
I think our approach has been sort of the capacity building, to sort of explain why it's important, explain. And I, for example, each time say, well, why would you want your hard drive to be encrypted in your laptop? Because they will say, oh, well, I've got a password on it. Yeah, okay. So you take out the hard drive, you pop it in another machine, the password is no longer needed. Yeah, so that's so I try to explain it in easy language why maybe you want to encrypt it, because it gives that extra safeguards, and then to say, and these are the ways we can do it, and let's do it together. So with the organizations, for example, in Myanmar, we did a session of an hour of just doing it together. I showed them how I would do it, and then they each followed me sort of on their laptops there and then. So it's been about sharing that information, indicating why it's important, encouraging them to do it, but no, not enforcing. And just asking them to show me where they're keeping the data, how they're keeping the data, and then you might pick up on things as well. So the site visits have been very important, to sort of go to each of the organizations, spend a few days with them, and looking at the data and working with the data, and then things do get picked up on. Like one of the organizations in Colombia, sort of having lots of their data in a cloud-based system that wasn't secure and things like that, when they thought it was secure.
Okay,
But,
Fab. Thank you so much. I'll leave the floor to someone else.
yeah. Okay, so there's been a good suggestion on the approach needs to be proportionate to the level of risk. Participation in online training usually very low risk, yeah, compared to the research that people do. That's a good approach as well. Yeah, you can never remove all the risk. That's true. Let's look in the chat, but if anyone wants to ask something, please speak.
That I put on the chat as well. Is that okay? Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, yeah.
So I've set up I'm at the GCRF Trade Environment and Development Hub. I work as the data officer, and we've set up the research ethics committee internally for the project. So it's basically scientists who are already on the Trade Hub, who have agreed and mostly have a social sciences background, who've agreed to be on the committee. But really, they're few and far between, and we have about 5 people on the committee reviewing all the forms that come in.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned earlier that you also have, participation for the ethics committee from across all the local partners that you have as well.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering first whether they're all internal to the project. Second, whether they're all social scientists and have an ethics background, or have you also taken in people who probably just have contextual knowledge maybe, but don't really know about ethics in that sense. And the other thing is also, if you're getting someone from outside the project, are you paying them? Is there compensation involved as a consultant?
No, we do have, there is external people which would have been brought in. So the panel already existed before I joined the project. I joined the project a year into the project. So there were certain things already put in place. So my understanding of the panel was that there is external people on there which would have been invited on there by the PI, by our PI of the project. So they're also UK based, but not involved in the project directly, but so in an advisory role, but have got lots of experience with working in low income countries, for example, doing ethnography research. Then we have representatives from the different partner organizations, and that can change a bit. We try to make sure that each time there's one person for each of the countries. They obviously are based within the partner organization that does the research. So yes, they have in a way that research background, and they know the local context. Yeah. So I guess the majority of those would be social ethnography researchers in a way. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And for the externals, do you know whether you're compensating them?
No.
Yeah. Okay.
No.
Thank you.
No.
Thanks.
You will always find people happy to do that, to be on your advisory group as an advisor to a project. I think so.
It's good for them, I guess, on their resume or whatever it is to have it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's good.
There's another question here I see from Alistair Stewart. How do you know whether personal information, whether something could still identify a person, yes or no? And that is really complex, and I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to that, especially in when you're looking at qualitative data, interviews you've done, or life histories or something like that. And I don't think anyone has got the answer to that. I mean, in quantitative data, there's a lot of statistical techniques that are being applied to try and determine whether or not information is disclosive. Again, it's just an approach that you take. You can never measure it 100% secure. So I guess it needs to be based on having experience with the data and the understanding of the data, and to try and understand whether there would be a risk of identification. But the main thing to keep in mind is, and it's why I think when we worked at UKDA, we always emphasize that using the wording such as "we will fully anonymize the data" is very, it's not a good idea, because it's very difficult to guarantee when data is fully anonymous. We would sort of say, well, your data is fully anonymous once you've put it through the shredder, right? Then it's fully anonymous. And up until then, you're talking about minimizing that risk. And it's again what's said now about having recordings of online training. How big is the risk? And keeping in mind the sort of, you don't want to do harm to participants. You need to minimize the risk of them being identified, but you can probably never guarantee it 100%, especially in qualitative data. But can you measure it? No, you can't. No. Don't know whether other people have experience with that.
Thanks very much for that. The other big thing was just in relation to special category data. So we're not collecting any names, contact information, addresses, or anything like that. But it's, every time I've read guidance about special category data, there seems to be wildly different interpretations on if you collect anything that's considered special category, all the regulations apply, or whether if everything else is anonymized, whether you can, like, that's considered fine.
Yeah. Again, because if there's no other personal data you have and you only know that a person has a certain ethnicity, for example, then that cannot be identifying information. So it's and I know that we would see that in data sets as well, where people maybe do research about political views and then go, oh, that's special categories of data. Well, no, it's only special categories if you can identify the person with their political view attached to it, or with their sexual orientation attached to it. So it's not special category if all you know about a person is that they have a certain political view, because you still can't identify it. So it's trying to trying to keep that clear, I think, as to information can only disclose the identity of a person if you have enough information together to identify that person. If you know that I am a white female of that particular age in the UK, then you can never find me, because in a population of 70 million, there's so many of me, yeah, that are, if you only have those three categories, and you could have my political view on top of it, for example, but it can never identify me. It can only identify me if you have enough information, if you maybe know where I live and what work I do, or you have other very distinguishing information about me, or you're looking at a very small population group. You've done your research in one particular village, and then you've only got a small group of people. So it's important to keep that in context, that an item of personal information on its own is probably not personal information, because it can't identify a person. No.
Right. I would like just to say thank you, because for me that I'm not very familiar, my name is Alfonso, I am part of the Research Quality Project. It's been quite enlightening this workshop. I intend not to work especially with kind of personal data or sensitive data, but in any case, I do consider that while working in a GCRF project, everything just mixes. So it's been very informative for me. That's why precisely I've been, I've written if it would be fine, for example, to share your presentation with other members of the team.
Oh yeah, sure.
And further to that, and I'm going to play this quite simple. If you would recommend kind of any sort of course or date information that I can consult, just like data management for dummies in terms of ethics and consent and everything. What
in terms of ethics and consent,
yeah,
and data management, I think I can share the link. Obviously, I mean, I worked for 13 years at the UK Data Archive, and we did just that. We wrote a lot of guidance. We wrote a lot of guidance for researchers, and of course, it's really helpful now to be able to implement that and see where it does work. I mean, you
Okay,
can
okay.
implement
Then,
it. So.
then I can
So
start there.
the UKDA is of course a good source of information, but there's a lot of information I know on the website, so it can sometimes be a bit difficult to get through all the bulk of the information that's there. But a few years ago, we wrote a guide for a research program called the Ecosystem Services and Poverty Alleviation Program that was funded by DFID ESRC NERC. And so together with a person from that program who sort of had a data oversight role as well, and some of the researchers, we wrote a very practical guide. I think it's 20 pages, so I can point you to that. It's still available on the ESPA, on the ESPA website as a guide. So it gives all the key aspects of data management in that type of research setup, which I think is similar to GCRF projects. So you're working in low-income countries, you're working with local partners, you're working with a lot of diversity, a lot of complexity. People might be doing illicit activities, and you're capturing that information, etc. So yeah, I'll send you. I can probably put it in the chat.
Yeah, that would be great.
Now, let me, if I quickly Google it.
While you're doing that, Veerle, can I just thank you for the webinar and everybody else who's participated. We've lost a few, but who participated today. I will be sending out the evaluation in sometime later this afternoon. So I'd be grateful if you could complete that. It's very short. And some of you may be joining us again on Friday for the session that we've got on Friday morning. So we look forward to seeing you then if you come along to that. And yeah, I hope you have a good summer if we don't see you on Friday, and we'll keep you informed of any other future activities that we can share and extend to the GROW community.
Thank you for that, Jay, and thanks for setting this up and doing all the organization. So I've put that link in the chat box. So thanks, everyone. And yeah, as Jay said, Friday I do another session on the practicalities of how do you document and prepare your data if you want to be archiving them and placing them in a data repository. So enjoy the rest of your day, and good luck with your projects.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.